see if it's one of those towels or something. I'm starting a meeting right now, so just a heads up. Hey, good morning, y'all. Can you guys, if you have a notebook, we're gonna have a pretty short meeting today. It's gonna be mostly work, and I'll explain that in a minute. I haven't read your poems yet, but I see that they're all in there, so I'll take a look at those when we meet. Also, I just posted the week stuff on, and for Wednesday, we're not gonna meet in person. We're just gonna Zoom at 2, okay? And we're gonna kind of go over what you're doing today in class, all right? Okay, these terms are mostly review, and I can post them afterwards if you like, but they're terms that are frequently used with poems. So the first one is alliteration, which I think is the one you know probably the best. And obviously alliteration is the repetition of the first sound in a series of words. The words don't have to be next to each other. And it can be 2 or more words. So if I said, you know, like tongue twisters are alliterative. So if we see Peter Piper picks pickled peppers, we're repeating the P sound. Sometimes the definition says the first consonant sound because if you repeat, a lot of times in English, if a word starts with a vowel, the sound is more like the first consonant sound, but we can just say for our purposes, repetition of the first sound in a series of words. The 2 related terms to alliteration that I want to focus on that are a little tougher to identify at first are assonance and consonance. Assonance is A-S-S-O-N-A-N-C-E, and it's the repetition of vowel sounds. As I said, vowels tend to get gobbled up by the consonants around them, and American English is fairly atonal and flat compared to like British English. And so sometimes it's picking out sounds is not easy to do, but an example for assonance would be, usually if you have long vowels, it's easier to pick out, but that's not mandatory. So if I said late, fake, okay, late and fake, we have that long or open A sound would be repeated. So it's not a rhyme, but there's something going on that makes the sound of a line interesting, and assonance is repetition of vowel sounds. Similarly, consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds, and that's C-O-N-S-O-N-A-N-C-E. We are going to be, for one of your little assignments today, you're going to be reading a short passage from Macbeth. And in that passage, it's a famous speech at the end of the play, whereas Colin would know this, I'm sure. Macbeth is comparing life to a bad actor, and he says, who struts and frets his hour upon the stage. And strut and fret, he's repeating both R's and T's and S's. And so while the words don't rhyme, it's very close to a rhyme. And that repetition is called consonance. Okay, so we have 3 things that we can talk about when we're talking about the sound of poems is alliteration, assonance, and consonance. And then a 4th thing, which is sometimes easy to spot out, is rhyme. And there's something also called off rhyme. So what we call rhyme is usually can also be called perfect rhyme. So, all right, you know what rhyme is, or end rhyme. So I'm going to give you a short little Valentine poem, which is roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. So blue and you are end rhyme or perfect rhyme. And then we talk about rhyme scheme. And rhyme scheme, you probably know, is the pattern of rhyme, the pattern of end rhyme in a poem. And so that poem, the rhyme would be A, B, C, B, okay? So roses are red, red would be A. Violets are blue, blue doesn't rhyme with red, so that would be B. Sugar is sweet, sweet would be C. And so are you, you rhymes with blue, so it would be A, B, C, B. Okay, and we'll do a little practice with rhyme scheme later. About every, I would say every 4 or 5 years, at least, maybe slightly more frequently, one of the poems that they give you for your essay on the AP exam is a sonnet. And sonnets are a particular kind of poem that use, there's different types of sonnets and different type of rhyme schemes, but it's a good style of poem to be aware of and know about heading into that exam. And sometimes even in the multiple choice, they'll use a sonnet as well. Okay. So there's also something, if you can put down the definition for slant rhyme or off rhyme. Colin, I don't see you there, but are you familiar with the definition of off rhyme or slant rhyme?
Yeah, sorry, I'm here.
Well, how would you define that?
Like it doesn't perfectly rhyme, but they sound kind of similar.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's when a poet uses words that don't quite perfectly rhyme, okay, but he's using it as a rhyme, or she is using it as a rhyme. So like you might use the words dead and road. They don't rhyme, but if a poet will sometimes, to make the rhyme scheme fit, or even just to make an interesting sound. Let's say I said porch, I'll give you a Halloween theme. If I said porch and corpse, that's not a rhyme, but it's similar in sound, so that that might work that way. So that's slant rhyme or off rhyme, if you see that. Okay. All right. I gave you kind of a whole bunch of little tasks here, a bunch of poems to read, and I would want you to feel free to do these with somebody else if you want to use your phone or whatever. I think sometimes, especially at first, reading poems and talking about them is useful to do together, or kind of hash them out together. The first batch is there's 5 poems that all are short poems that have 1-word titles. I'm just going to give you a real quick synopsis of them. There's a poem called Digging by an Irish poet named Seamus Heaney. And that poem is actually, I saw him read it one time, and he said, as he introduced it, he said that he was the first person in his family to go to college. He ended up teaching at Harvard, so he did well for himself. But he said that was kind of about, you know, the genesis of that poem was looking at his father and grandfather and family and thinking about their lives and his life a little bit. Okay. There's a poem, Stone, by a guy named Charles Simic, that's sort of an odd little poem. You'll see. There is a poem, Famous, in which a woman, Naomi Nye, makes actually she works with connotation in that poem. So we have denotation and connotation are 2 terms that you're familiar with. Denotation, the literal definition, and connotation, what do we think about when we think about an image or a word? The associations a word or image carries with it. There's a poem called Mirror by Sylvia Plath, which is an extended metaphor, and it is so it's a poem told from the perspective of a mirror, and about the woman who looks into the mirror. And then there's a poem called Cross by Langston Hughes, a very short poem. And that poem also works with, well, actually, I'm going to look at denotation. So I'm asking you in that poem to tell me what are a bunch of different titles for the word, meanings for the word cross, because the word cross doesn't appear in the poem except in the title. And I'm going to ask you about the how do you see that working? Okay. Then there's a longer poem, and I gave you this one because it's more like the kind of poem that you'll get on the AP exam typically. It's called Toads by an English poet named Philip Larkin. And there's just 4 or 5 questions about that poem that you'll have to do a little thinking. That's a good one, I think, to talk out with your friend or another person after you've read it. And then we're going to be sort of like the haiku, to extend that a little bit. There's many poems that are comprised primarily of concrete images. And I gave you 3. One is, 2 are by Robert Frost. And Robert Frost is probably America's most popular poet. He was a farmer who didn't really like farming that much, and he lived by Boston. You've all, I'm sure, come across some of his poems. And towards the end of his life, he read a poem at Kennedy's inauguration, and that sort of started a tradition, which is not always followed, of having a poet read at inaugurations, and sometimes writing poems specifically for that event, which is called an occasional poem. So 2 of his poems, one's called Out Out, which is an allusion to a line in Macbeth. And I put that little, so after you read the Frost poem, I also attached that speech, which starts tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, from Macbeth there. So read that, because there's one question about that. And then lastly, there's a poem by a beat poet from San Francisco, Allen Ginsberg, who was sort of a, I don't know, hippie poet in his day. And I attached him reading the poem that he wrote. You can, and there's just a couple of questions about that one as well. So in those, I'm asking you about the imagery usually, but also some things, there's some questions about poetic devices and whatnot. Okay, so that, if you do those all, I'm sure that will take you, you got 45 minutes here. You might be able to get done in that amount of time. It might take you a little bit more than that. Those are due Wednesday. You can just put them on a document. For whatever reason, when people answer on paper and submit photos, it's hard for me to usually enlarge them sufficiently to see. So I would prefer that you type them out. If you do them in your notebook, do them large and clearly, and you can submit them that way. But if you can have those, we'll discuss those on Wednesday. Like I said, on Wednesday, we're just going to meet as a Zoom rather than meet in person, if that works for everybody. Okay, any questions from there? All right, like I said, I would strongly suggest you read, and if you want to link with a buddy, that's perfectly acceptable. Of course, you are welcome to do them on your own as well, either way. But that's a bunch of questions for those poems, and they're due Wednesday. All right, that's it. Go to work. We'll see you on Wednesday.